to the Credential Engine CTDL Terms Proposal webinar. All, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. I recognize many of you. And I think there's also some folks that have joined today that are kind of new to the CTDL process. And we have got a lot to cover, but we will get into 3 CTDL terms proposals today. And I'll give you a little context as we go into each one of those proposals, so everyone will understand kind of our process as well and how we add terms to the credential, transparency, description, language. And I am Jeannie Kitchens, Chief Technology Services Officer with Credential Engine. And with me today to talk about each of these proposals is Stuart Sutton, our metadata consultant. And I know Deb Everhart has joined. She had a big hand in this contextualizing skills and competencies task group, new CTDL terms. So Deb may want to say a couple of things as well. And we'll have Phil Barker talking about expanding the credential transparency description language in the area of learning programs and courses. And finally, we'll talk about transfer value and a transfer intermediary CTDL proposal that Nate Argo and I will talk about. And each person will introduce themselves when it comes to their part, because we do have so much to cover today. And of course, we'll talk about some next steps on how all of you can contribute by providing us feedback on these terms. Before we jump into the contextualizing skills and competencies task group, I had mentioned that what we're doing today is part of a larger process, and maybe Scarlett or another team member can put links into the chat, those who want to check this out. But when we work on the credential transparency description language here at Credential Engine, we do it through open processes where we, for large changes, will create a task group of subject matter and technical experts. And we have a number of meetings. We go through a number of iterations of feedback to begin a process to develop these proposals. And we do this through a namespace policy and a significant updates policy. So that's what we're doing today. And where we are in terms of these processes is now we're introducing these proposals to a larger group of people, of interested persons that are members of other advisory groups besides our technical advisory group, and other interested stakeholders that would like to contribute by providing feedback on these proposals. And when we get to the end of the presentation, you'll see that we don't expect all the feedback to occur during this webinar. This is mostly informational today. You will have plenty of time to provide feedback and multiple options to do so. So we can address your questions in the chat as we go along, and we will have time for some Q&A throughout the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the contextualizing skills and competencies task group. Stuart Sutton, I know, was just in another meeting, and I think he wants to give his voice a little rest. So Stuart, allow me to kick this off. And for Deb to make some comments and spare your voice. First of all, a little history. We had a very large task group. We had over 100 members join it. We held 6 meetings with them for a period of time where we met every other week and they reviewed materials in between meetings. We followed a charter, and the group participated in a number of ways, including providing use cases and real world examples that we logged, and we iterated the CTDL domain model and terms proposal, which is what we're going to take a look at today. We also developed real world examples based on the task group's feedback. That task group's work has concluded. We may ask for them to reconvene, but that would be in a slightly different context. For now, their work is done. And it's important to know that with that task group charter, that it was important to kind of broadly couch competencies as an umbrella term. And I wanted this in here just so we can be sure that we all understand that when we use the word competency, instead of saying a very long sentence. For example, skills, ability, knowledge, dispositions, habit of practice, capabilities, learning outcome, learning objective. Regardless of the community of practice, the competency is going to be our umbrella term, and our model works for all of those. So it doesn't matter if you want to describe, knowledge, skills, abilities, learning objectives, and so forth. This proposal covers all of those nuances. And it is also important to know that the credential transparency description language already is used to describe competencies and competency frameworks. And there are many competency frameworks published to the Credential Registry. If you would like to see them, you can use the Credential Finder, and someone can drop a link in the chat to that. You can, of course, take a look at that a little bit later, though. And so the main purpose of this task group was not to reinvent what is already done with the CTDL, but we are seeing work that is really highly focused on skills and competencies, and those skills and competencies being outside or before, I suppose, the context of a competency framework. And so we really needed to look at how competencies or skills and other learning objectives, whatever the community of practices wants to call them, how at that level, those competencies can point out to other things that substantiate them, describe them further. So anyone looking at those competencies can have a better understanding of their contextualization and their relationship to other things in the world. And we'll take a look at that in just a moment. So that was our focus. It was to identify those things, of course, that were not already covered with the credential transparency description language, which everyone is, of course, welcome to check out via our technical website and our handbook. And I'm not sure if Stuart has joined or not. I will ask him to touch on this, but I'm going to go ahead and get that started.
Yeah, Jeannie, I can begin. I can begin a little bit. My voice. Okay. I am losing my voice, but
yeah, I don't want you to lose your voice, Stuart.
Well, I just sucked on a Cepacol lozenge, so I'm probably good for a little mileage.
Did you want to talk through this then?
Well, I think it's important to this piece of work to understand that what we are primarily talking about when we talk about in this context of this work group and so forth of competency is what I call the outbound links. These would be, in other words, assertions of relationships between a competency and something external to it. Those external things could be in the same competency framework, but they don't have to be. They could be like the conceptual entities up at the top. Those could be separately defined concept schemes that are referenced. The key is that in the essence is that the competency itself is referencing out to something else. So, and thus the directionality of these arrows is very important. And the main thrust in contextualizing the competency for us here in the work that we've done is to look at these outbound links and go, are there from the use cases, and there were many, I think over 70 use cases, of the use cases, are there any that can't be expressed via these outbound links? Next, Jeannie. And basically, they're in a conversation around these, the directionality of these links. The one I was just talking about for us is the primary relationship, and it's the outbound arc, the one going from a competency out, an assertion that that by a competency that it is good for that task or good for that job or whatever the other mapping predicate might be. So there's the outbound. There are inbound links. We know this. There are inbound links to pointing to competencies from inside frameworks and from outside frameworks, third parties that say my task or my job or my work role requires and points into a competency. So the secondary relationships are the reverse. They're things from outside the competency itself that are pointing to and relating to it. And then the tertiary relationship is the reciprocal one, where one points out and the other points in. So the competency may point out with a requires property to a task, and the tasks points to the competency competency points out to a task with required by, and the task says that it requires and it points in. So those are the three relationships. The key one for us in this work was the primary, the outbound arc. Next. And I think you can go on, Jeannie. I don't think.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yes, this just reinforces and shows a little closer up view of those arrows and those outbound arcs and the numerous, conceptual entities, resource entities down here that a competency can point out to, that were the primary relationship that Stuart was talking about and the focus of the task group. And we do have some examples because, as we already noted, the credential transparent description language already, does a great job describing competencies and competency frameworks. And there are numerous frameworks published to the registry. This is showing an outbound example from a competency, and this is seen through the credential finder. And here we have a competency framework, and there was a little red arrow here. I don't know where it went off to, but where I'm moving my mouse around are external things that this competency here, this competency statement is pointing out to. So that's an example of an outbound link. And for inbound relationships, as Stuart had already well covered, those secondary relationships where things are pointing into a competency. And at Credential Engine, we certainly see that very often with credentials, with learning opportunities, with assessments, for example, pointing to competencies. And we have many examples already published to the registry if you would like some context for that. And this is another example that can be seen through the Finder. We can put a link in the chat to both of the examples that I just showed. And this one shows a credential, a badge that has been published that points to competencies in a competency framework. And so that is inbound to the competency as opposed to outbound from the competency. So those are a couple of great examples that anyone can take a look at through the Credential Finder. And again, this is really important because we're looking at the directionality, and we're focusing here with our proposal today on the arrows going out from the competency to other things. And Stuart, do you want to quickly touch on this model? There is a link to it, we know, and if you have a large screen, you can probably see this quite well. If you're on a smaller device, you may not see all of the details, but we can provide a quick overview so you don't have to see every nuance of this.
Well, it's even on a large screen, it's
a lot there.
There's a lot there, and it just doesn't show up that well since there's so much. Yeah. This is just a section of what we call the domain model. The full domain model it contains everything from pathways, credentials, assessment. So it's quite large. but we wanted to focus this small sectional domain model on the competency, which Jeannie is cursoring around in red. And what you're seeing on the screen, with the exception of the blue nodes, the two blue nodes, collection on the right and workforce demand action on the left, with the exception of those two blue nodes, there are no additional classes or types of things that the work on contextualizing discovered. So those are the only two new things to an already existing model. The blue arc labels, the labels on the arcs themselves, which relate back to the conversation we just had. The blue are new properties, new attributes needing to be expressed through properties in the schema for the contextualization work. Now, there actually aren't quite as many as there appear because some of them are repeated, but in essence, then everything in black already exists. Those things in blue do not. Now, a word about the entities in blue, the collection entity on this side. Competencies if you look at most of the stuff in the Credential Engine, competencies are logically aggregated in competency frameworks. There are in the ecosystem and flowing out of the use cases, things that are less formal than competencies, than competency frameworks. And one of them is the collection, which, and that's the blue. So in order to satisfy aggregations of skills, competencies into these higher level entities, we needed to add another class in order to handle some of those relationships. So competency is now going to be defined as a subclass, a kind of collection, but collection does not assume the kind of structure that we expect with a competency framework. So that's one. The other, up in the left-hand corner, is workforce demand action, and we'll kind of reserve that conversation for a little later. One of the things that came out in the use cases was the ability to denote the employment demand level, the demand level for a competency, and that is part of that blue workforce demand action thing is kind of part of the architecture for enabling that. But Gina, unless you've got something else.
No, let's go ahead and go through. So now we will be able to see the readable text. So no worries. All we know is it's small on here, but we're going to cover the text that is difficult to read. No worries.
Jeannie, could you do me a favor? Could you just go go into edit mode? I want you to edit something. I thought I had edited this out.
Okay.
That subclass of is incorrect. Over in the diagram. In the diagram.
Okay. Let me,
right, yeah, let's get it. Yeah, grab that. Yeah, delete.
Oh, okay.
Just delete it.
All right.
And the arrow. Super. Sorry.
All right, continue on.
Okay. So we create this new collection entity, and that collection has members. In other words, it is a collection. It's an aggregation of related resources, so it doesn't have to be a competency, but in this illustration, what we're looking at here, it is. So the collection has members, and competencies are members. They're members of collections. So a competency could be I'm going to use the word member. It's kind of not correct, but it could be a member of a competency framework, but it could also be a member of a collection.
Right. And this is certainly a use case, anybody who's a member of Open Skills Network that you recognize, and there may be others that aren't a part of that, that are utilizing kind of collections of things. And the reason for the definition of a collection being aggregation of related resources is we would foresee having a collection of things being useful, not only to, if you want to have a collection of skills or competencies, but other things, possibly tasks is a great example as well, or courses. So the definition allows for competencies and other types of things to be, associated together in a collection. And I'm going to go ahead and move on. As Stuart had already noted on the diagram, if something is in a collection, it would be a member of that collection. And so a collection would have members or has members. So a member of a collection could be a skill or a competency, and a skill or a competency could be a member of, and that is member of a collection. Anything else to talk about with that, Stuart, or shall I move on to the next?
Yeah, move on, Jeannie.
Okay, I'll do that. Here we're seeing a number of terms that if you saw a close-up of that model, these would have been the blue text that you saw in the arrows that are new terms that we're introducing. And as we have clearly pointed out, as we're really looking at the competency pointing out to other things, and what we're really seeing through many, many use cases is a need to be able to point out to things that substantiate the skill or the competency. And those things we want to be able to call them out specifically. So we want to be able to identify substantiating competency frameworks, substantiating courses, substantiating credentials, substantiating jobs, substantiating occupations. And you'll notice that the definitions of these terms are all very similar. They're written in the same structure, and they swap out the aspects of the reference. In the first definition, competency framework provides some justification that the resource being described is useful. And that definition is exactly how these arcs are used. The need is to be able to point out to other things that are for substantiating the skill or the competency. So all of these terms are on the arrows that you saw. They all point to objects that are already covered with the CTDL. But these would be new properties for being able to point a competency, and have those outbound arcs to these things like a competency framework, a course, credential, and so forth. I'm going to go ahead, Stuart, and jump to the next one because it's a long list.
Yeah.
We have substantiating organization. And a good example of that is an employer. Substantiating learning program, substantiating resource, substantiating task, and substantiating work role. All of these had many use cases, real world use cases, where there is a need to be able to have in the data that describes the competency to the substantiating thing on the other end. And what these terms do is they tell us what to expect on the other end of that substantiating. If we just said, for example, substantiating, only substantiating resource, for example, or just substantiating, we would not know what was on the other end, right? So we would not know, for example, it was verbatim an organization that substantiates the competency or the skill. And so you'll see, again, all these definitions are written in the same structure. And you can see the example of substantiating organization, that it is a referenced organization. And so the difference between each definition is the reference, which is self-described in the term CTDL term itself. Stuart, anything else
No,
to say
no,
about
I think you're good.
that? Okay. And another thing that was very prevalent in the use cases, and as we indicated, we had a very large task group, and we were looking from many different, lenses, and some of those were on the education side, some of those were on the business employer side. And of course, the military juxtaposes both. It's employer, it's business, it's training. And these types of terms here in the use cases for needing these new condition types, very prevalent in military use cases, very prevalent in other initiatives such as the job data exchange, or some may know it as JDX, and in many job descriptions where these types of performance, impacts, I suppose, are prevalent. And so we saw the need based on the uses case for environmental hazard type, performance level type, physical capability type, and sensory capability type. And again, noteworthy is these types of impacts on performance of a skill or competency are also very relevant to, for example, tasks and work roles. We saw this in many, for example, job descriptions in the healthcare field, right? And these are clearly applicable, beyond the healthcare field. That's just a really good example. In the military, another really good example as well. And Stuart, what else should we point out about these terms?
I would note, and maybe Jeannie, if you're driving, each of these four things have right in their definitions. It ends with the definition ends with a semicolon and then says select from an existing enumeration of such types. What we are expecting these properties to reference are controlled vocabularies of, for example, hazard types, controlled vocabularies of level type, and so forth. So, and that's with each of these types. So the thing on the other end, the thing they're pointing to, is a concept scheme of that type. We do not, at least at this point, Credential Engine does not intend to actually define those enumerations, those concept schemes. I don't think at this point, and it's possible, quite possible, that there would be more than one listing, depending on the context of what is a hazard. A hazard, where is the hazard? Is it in the operating, what kind of is it an operating room? Is it a firefighter? So those vocabularies might vary. So we expect that there will be more than one, but the point here is that that these are not free text terms, that these are drawn from controlled lists.
Right, and Stuart, and that there could be many controlled lists, or it doesn't have to be one. So it's really up to, say, the employer that utilizes these types, or the military, or the education entity to define those types, and the CTDL will support it, for as an example. And let's go over these additional terms: source documentation and inferred competency. Source documentation, definitely a need to be able to point out to source documentation. We saw many use cases. We have very concrete use cases in the military where a skill or competency needs to point out to a very specific document, such as maybe a blueprint, something about an engineered system, for example. So source documentation is for those scenarios, and inferred competency is one that we're looking forward to some feedback on. And inferred competency, I'm going to read the definition for this one. Competency deduced or arrived at by reasoning on the competency being described. So what we're saying here is because of this competency, some other competency, we're going to deduce that this person has an inferred competency. Anything to clarify that, Stuart?
No, it's a property that showed up in the use cases, but has been on the agenda of a number of initiatives. Being able to say that, being able to infer or to deduce that because this competency exists, you can assume that a competency over there has been fulfilled. So it's being able to deduce and infer from the competency in hand relationships to other competencies.
Yeah, and this is one that we've received some really great kind of insights and feedback on, and looking forward to more conversation, in particular on inferred competency. And I'm going to go ahead and move on because we have a lot more to cover here. As Stuart noted in the diagram that you saw earlier, there was workforce demand action. And certainly we see, credentials, learning opportunities, and competency frameworks needing to point out to information about labor market demand. And now we're seeing it at the skill and competency level as skills and competencies are being, authored and created for specific contexts. They're being based on those substantiating resources that we looked at. They're being based on documentation, as we described, and they're also being based on demand and labor market information. And so what this introduces is an additional class. We already have ways of describing aggregate outcome data, and this provides a way to point out to information in the world about workforce demand. And so again, these are the blue terms that you saw in the diagram, and the competency can point out to indicate the level of demand for that particular skill or competency.
And Jeannie,
yeah.
and that in-demand action provides the mechanism for the assertion by an agent that this resource, I'm sorry, in-demand.
Yes.
Yeah.
By an agent. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Go on. Wasn't what I thought.
Yep. And so all of these terms are documented in a proposal that is a Google document that on which a person can comment on. For technical folk, there's this thing called GitHub. It's a repository where you can make comments on the proposal as well. And what we're going to be asking for, we will be sending links to the terms proposal, which is a Google document. I'm going to do a really fast screen share of it because we're going to move on to our next proposal. And it includes instructions. And what it does is, just like the diagram that Stuart went over, it identifies CTL terms that already exist and the proposed terms. And the reason it includes both is so it's hard to know if something proposed works with everything else without seeing it in the context of the CTDL. And so things highlighted in yellow are proposed. The definitions are included here, and it's organized to identify the CTDL classes and the CTDL properties. And folks can comment on this by highlighting something and right-clicking and selecting comment. And we will be reviewing all comments that are provided via this format. Otherwise, oops, I didn't mean to do that. You can also, as I said, use our GitHub issue or email us at Credential Engine. So we're providing 3 options for providing feedback on that terms proposal as a follow-on to the task group. And Stuart, I'm going to move on. We do have a lot to cover today. And so we're going to go on to the proposal to extend CTDL in the area of learning opportunities. And Phil Barker will be covering this area.
Yep, thank you, Jeannie. Do you mind continuing to drive the slides?
I am more than happy to do that.
That's great. This proposal is in 3 parts. The first 2 parts I hope are fairly straightforward. The third part we will definitely need some more input on. Of course, if you have any comments about any of it, then the mechanism for providing those comments is similar to what Jeannie just described for the competencies piece of work, and we'll be reviewing those towards the end of this part of the call. The 3 parts are as follows: distinguishing programs from courses, showing when learning opportunities are for one reason or another not currently available, and the third one, indicating typical scheduling patterns for learning opportunities. Let's move on to the next slide, which describes the first of those in a little bit more detail. And I think, especially if you're involved in higher education, you'll understand the difference between a course and a program. Well, there are many different types of program. There are funding programs, there are sports programs, there are recruitment programs, but in particular, we're thinking here of learning programs. And essentially, the relationship between a learning program and a course is that it's a bit similar to the difference between boats and ships. You can put boats on a ship, but you can't put ships on a course, or something like that. So a learning program may have several courses in it, and that's essentially the difference between the two. A course won't have learning programs in it. So what we want to do is to distinguish between learning programs and courses as distinct types of learning opportunities. That's not to say that they are the only types of learning opportunities. We know that learning opportunities cover a wide range of different informal and formal types of opportunity. We also know that learning programs have got parts that are not courses. Learning programs can have assessments in them, they can have work placements in them, they can have all sorts of things. But for various reasons, the 2 that we have use cases for wanting to call out as distinct types of learning opportunity are learning program and course. The final thing before you move on that I want to emphasize is that just because a course can be part of a learning program, it doesn't mean that it's part of only one learning program, and it doesn't in fact mean that it's part of any learning program. A course may be a standalone course. So next slide. This gives a simple illustration of how a learning program can have courses in it. In this case, there's a learning program on applied data science, which has 4 courses: data management, introductory statistics, data analysis in R, data analysis in Python. Those courses might be parts of other programs. And if we move on to the next slide, we also show in more detail than you can see, unless you've got a very big screen, that how the role of those courses within the program might not be equal. And that is that there's a pathway associated with this program. And in order to proceed through that pathway to earn a credential, which is shown middle top there, you have to take 2 of the courses. The introductory statistics and the data management course are there at the bottom at stage 1. And you also have to take 1 of the other courses. And this is this information is expressed through a part of CTDL that we have already developed, which is the pathways part. And the reason why we do it this way is because this means that we don't say that a course is mandatory or optional. We don't say that a course is available at stage 1 or stage 2. And we don't say those because a course that is optional in one program might be mandatory in another program. A course that's offered at stage 1 in one program might be offered at stage 4 or 5 in another program. So the courses sit alone as self-contained things, and we can use the pathways and pathway components to say things about how they are used to build up a pathway that leads to a credential. So I think that's it on programs and courses. The second thing that we wanted to be able to do was to provide ways that institutions can advertise courses that are in development but not yet available, or that somebody who's providing information about an individual can refer to a learning opportunity that is no longer being offered. This might be important for somebody's transcript or resume or CV. So what we're proposing here is a single property that will point to a controlled vocabulary, that is a Scots concept scheme, that allows you to say that the life cycle status type of a learning opportunity, a learning program, a course, is developing, active, suspended, or ceased. So those have definitions that are fairly obvious from the names, although I should say the definitions are the ones that are obvious from the names. It's worth commenting that we can already do this for credentials using a slightly different vocabulary set, but there was no way of doing it for things like learning opportunities. There's a quick example on the next slide, I believe. So this shows that program that we mentioned earlier, the one in applied data science, has a life cycle status type of ceased. So it's no longer available. It might still be important to people to know that it once happened, you know, especially if you took it and you want to refer to it in your resume, but it ceased, and therefore we will know not to advertise it to new students. And the next slide, we move on to the more complicated part, which is the scheduling patterns of learning opportunities, including programs and courses. The reason why we want to do this is because it's vitally important for some learners to know whether a course is available in the evenings, for example, or weekends. You know, they might be working during the day, but still want to take courses to, you know, earn credentials, to improve their career opportunities or other aspects of their life. So it's really important for many students to know if a course is available at times when they are not working. However, we don't want to get into the level of detail that's required, for example, for calendaring applications. You know, we don't want to give the full schedule of when every single lecture, workshop, whatever of a course takes place. And we also don't want to get into the sort of detail that's required for describing course instances or course sections, which is to say, you know, a particular offering of a course that took place in fall of 2019, for example. We just want to give a general overview of what the scheduling pattern of a learning opportunity is. However, as we looked into this, we realized that the simplest way of doing it might not be, probably won't be sufficient to meet user needs. The simplest way of doing it is with just a simple property of scheduling type that points to a concept. And the next slide shows an example of this. So this shows that the data analysis with Python course was available, you know, schedule type of evening and weekdays. So that's telling you that the this course was available during weekdays in the evening, which is fine. However, what if the course was also available at weekends during the day? If you use just a simple property to illustrate that, you'll have properties that tell you that it's available evenings, weekdays, weekends, during the day. And you've got no way of disentangling which of those goes with which to give you sensible options. In fact, your inference from that would probably be that it was, you know, in evenings during the week and during the day, during the weekends, which is a fairly heavy workload, but I guess quite possible. In order to show that those are two different options, you need to be able to do what I show on the next slide, Jeannie. You need to be able to group those those scheduling patterns together into what I've called scheduling profiles, and this allows you to disambiguate the combinations. So you know that in this case, there's a scheduling pattern towards the left, which is weekly in the evening on weekdays, and there's an alternative scheduling pattern on the right, which is weekly in the daytime at weekends. Now, what we found when we took this to the technical advisory group is that in fact it gets more complicated because, as we suspected, in fact, it's quite possible that these different scheduling patterns are available at different locations, or perhaps through different learning modalities. And so we probably need to think of a way of incorporating that information into this. So we need to be able to say that it's available in one town weekly during the day at weekends, and it's available somewhere else across the state weekly in the evening at weekdays. So that, I think, concludes the presentation of what we're proposing. Yeah, the questions that we have about scheduling pattern is the simple option sufficient? We strongly suspect now, having spoken to the technical advisory group, that it's not. Is the complex option necessary? We think it is. And do we need to allow for more information? In fact, we think we do. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that we consider whether this extra complexity is justified by real use cases and real data that's actually likely to occur, because we don't like adding too much complexity to CTDL. Nate especially doesn't like it when we do it, because he's the person who's got to do the programming to deal with it.
Right, Phil, but to your point, and we are definitely seeing that. I mean, everybody probably on this webinar is probably shaking their head. Yes, you know, the reality is there's these complex scheduling patterns out there, and we're seeing that our partners that have this data and need to be able to utilize the CTDL, whether in their own environment or publishing to the registry, are confirming that the simple solution would not be sufficient for them, whether it's they're in their own environment, a course instance somewhere else, not in the registry, or just rich descriptions of courses that they could publish to the registry. And Phil put together a wonderful document that is very readable. It's a Google document. It is linked here for the proposal to extend the CTDL in the area of learning opportunities. That, similar to the document that I just showed you, anyone can comment on that document. If there's folks that prefer the more technical way of commenting, we went over this with our technical advisory group, for example. You could use GitHub or you can email us. But what we're going to be doing as a follow-up is sending you direct links to these proposals that you can comment directly in, or use GitHub or email us to provide your feedback. And I'm going to move on to the very last proposal. So as you can see, we have been very busy. I'm going to talk briefly about transfer intermediary proposal, and I'm going to ask Nate Argo with our team to be ready to speak up as well. But just as with the other proposals, there's already CTDL terms in place for describing what we call transfer value profiles. And transfer value profiles have also been published to the Credential Registry. And you could see some great examples published by ACE in the Credential Finder. If anybody would put a link in the chat, you can take a look at this example, this screenshot that I have here in the Credential Finder. And the most familiar scenario, as you see here on the screen, happens when there is a transfer of credit earned in courses from one provider towards a credential by another organization. And we see this quite often in post-secondary situations where there is transfer value from credits, for example, from courses that somebody took at one institution and they want to transfer it to another. I'm sure everyone is familiar with that specific scenario. But there's also definitely state articulation agreements and other use cases where there are groupings of resources, for example, courses that have equivalent transfer values identified. And this proposal is to expand a little bit more on the CTDL terms we already have and the example of the data already published to the registry, to enable publishing these groupings that we very often see in state articulation agreements. And again, that's just one example. You may be thinking of others that you can share in the chat. And I'm going to ask Nate Argo to quickly talk about the idea here and how the proposal of actually introducing only two new terms is going to make it very efficient for states in particular to publish their articulated transfer values. Go ahead, Nate.
Yep. So what we're trying to do with CTDL is capture the approach we're looking at here on the screen, where Kansas has an ACC 1010 course, which is not a real course you could go and take. Rather, it's an abstraction that represents the requirements, the competencies, the things you would learn in the various accounting courses offered in the right-hand column here from a number of universities. And what we see is a pattern in not only Kansas, but other states as well, is they'll do what we're looking at here, where they'll have this sort of abstraction course. And so what we're doing is capturing that via the transfer intermediary class, allowing you to say, okay, the transfer intermediary is going to be ACC 1010, and then a number of transfer value profiles, one for each set of courses over on the right, whether it's a single course, financial accounting, or whether it's a set of courses, you have accounting 1, accounting 2, and so on. The transfer value profiles group those things together, and then those transfer value profiles are referenced by that transfer intermediary object as a way of saying, hey, all of these transfer value profiles transfer to or from this ACT 1010 pseudo course, if you will, this transfer intermediary. It's basically just a way of capturing the approach that's already in use in the states we've looked at so far.
And actually what Nate Argo did, who was just speaking, was we looked at real data and we have 4 solid examples here. And we've already met with individuals with at least 2 of these, or 3 of these organizations actually, just to confirm our proposal with them. And basically what we see across states is this scenario very similar to the screenshot that you just saw, where courses are transferable through formal agreements that are brokered by a state. And Nate, I'm just going to scroll down here to the 2 terms, because basically, and what it boils down to is we can get a big bang for a small change to the CTDL, as often happens because it's already a lot of terms and modeled to support a lot of use cases. So by adding a couple of terms, transfer intermediary as a class and intermediary 4, we will vastly improve the efficiencies on both the publishing side and consuming side, whether or not someone's publishing to the registry or in their own environments or in the wild. It'll be helpful for those parties. And just real quickly, Nate, I'm going to go ahead and click on one of your examples here. And oh, sorry, I didn't mean to click that link. I really meant to click this link. And while that page is loading, oh, there we go. Why don't you just talk briefly about what we're seeing here and how we have tested the data to ensure these two properties are viable.
Yeah, okay. So what we did was we took the data we were looking at a moment ago in that screenshot. We downloaded that, we parsed through it, removed duplicates and so on. And we boiled it down to, there are 32 organizations represented in that table. And if you were to go through and look at the intermediary courses like ACC 1010 and others, there are 108 of those in total, right there. And so those are the, I believe they're, what is it, statewide transfer is what Kansas calls those, statewide transfer courses. So you have financial accounting, other accounting, there's various other subjects if you were to scroll down. So those intermediaries are used to connect various sets of courses, which in this case, we're still captured as learning opportunity profiles. We didn't have courses ready to go at the time, which is the third tab there. There's over 2,700 different individual courses, some of which are grouped together, which are why you see 2,600 plus transfer value profiles, meaning that so ACC 1010 may have, I think it's on this tab actually, 35 transfer value profiles connected to it. Art Appreciation has 27 transfer value profiles connected to it, and so on. Each of those transfer value profiles, again, representing either a course or a set of courses for which transfer value is applicable to or from that intermediary. The JSON-LD data tab just shows a representation, a mock-up of sorts of what that would look like. And you can see in here, the first node is the transfer intermediary for financial accounting, so ACC 1010 again. So that's the class that we're going to be introducing. And then intermediary 4 is this array of references to the transfer value profiles themselves. And then each one of these transfer value profiles captures things like the credit, the subject, and of course the reference out to the learning opportunity, or more likely the course once we're all said and done itself.
Thank you, Nate. It was short and sweet. So again, we have multiple ways to provide feedback. We'll be sending direct links out to all of this, and I'm going to turn it over to Scarlett.
Yes, so thank you, Jeannie and Stuart and Phil and Nate for all presenting this great information today. So some next steps from you guys is to provide any comments or feedback on the proposals that we talked about today. As Jeannie mentioned, I will be sending out all of those links in a follow-up email, and I've also put them in the chat. And the comment period will remain open through October 15th. So you can comment and feedback on those proposals and then reach out to us if you have any questions before then. Any other closing mentions, Jeannie?
Yeah, and so as we already know, this is part of a larger process. And following that process, what will happen is we update the CTDL based on the feedback. So we will update the handbook, the publishing API, for example. So we will have additional work to do as well. And we know we covered a lot of information. We appreciate you joining and listening today. And please know you can always reach out to us and ask us questions. We are available and more than happy to answer them. So thank you.